responsibility for others. That religion feels like virtue, but psychologically it is bondage. And when healing begins, the first thing that truly changes is your relationship to responsibility. A healed empath is not someone who becomes cold. They become accurate. They no longer carry what is not theirs. They no longer confuse compassion with self-erasure. They no longer confuse spiritual love with psychological submission. This is why your identity cannot remain the same, because your previous identity was built around carrying what was never yours. Let us go deeper, because the psyche is always deeper than the story you tell yourself. Many empaths were formed inside an invisible family system where roles were more important than feelings. You became the peacekeeper, the translator, the stabilizer, the emotional medic. Perhaps there was a depressed parent who needed your brightness. Perhaps there was an anxious parent who needed your regulation. Perhaps there was anger in the home, or addiction, or coldness, or unpredictable moods. In such a system, a child does not develop a normal ego. A child develops a function, and the function becomes the identity. You become the one who knows what everyone needs. You become the one who senses tension before it erupts. You become the one who soothes. And you learn to do this so early, so thoroughly, that it becomes automatic. The body begins to scan the room, the way an animal scans for predators. The psyche begins to scan emotions the way a priest scans sins. You do not call it hypervigilance. You call it intuition. But the psyche knows. Later in life, when you are older, often between 35 and 60, the psyche begins to revolt. You begin to feel fatigue, not merely in the body, but in the soul. You begin to feel that your sensitivity no longer feels like a gift. It feels like a curse. Your heart becomes tired. Your interest in fixing dissolves. Your patience thins. You become strangely silent. You stop responding the way you used to. You begin to disappoint people simply by being real. And here the great transformation begins. You meet your shadow. Now many people misunderstand the shadow as evil. This is childish. The shadow is not evil. It is rejected life. It is the part of you that was exiled in order to maintain belonging. It contains anger. Yes. It contains selfishness. Yes. It contains desire, power, refusal, and instinct. But it also contains vitality. It contains truth. It contains your lost authority. In the empath, the shadow often contains one thing above all, the right to not care. This shocks the empath because the empath has built identity on caring. They have built value on emotional labor. To not care feels like death. It feels like betrayal. It feels like becoming what you hated. But psychologically, it is not death. It is individuation. It is the birth of the self as distinct from the role. And thus the empath's healing often begins with a crisis. If I stop caring, who am I? You see the question now. This is the exact place where identity must change. You cannot heal and remain the same, because your same depends on sacrifice. Your same depends on being the one who absorbs the emotional poison of others, so that the system can stay unchanged. Your same depends on being the emotional servant of other people's unconsciousness. Healing refuses that. Healing introduces a new inner law, reciprocity. This is why when an empath heals, relationships begin to collapse. Not because you become cruel, but because your psyche finally withdraws its agreement to be used. People who were comfortable around you because you never had needs begin to experience you as changed. People who benefited from your overfunctioning begin to feel abandoned. People who were unconsciously addicted to your emotional availability and to create dramas to pull you back into the old role. You must understand this. The empath's previous identity often served other people's unconscious complexes. Your sensitivity became a mirror they relied upon. Your forgiveness became a drug they used. Your willingness to explain became a way for them to avoid responsibility. Your constant giving became a permission slip for them to remain immature. So when healing begins, you are not only changing yourself, you are disrupting a system, and systems do not like disruption. This is why healing feels lonely. The empath often thinks loneliness means something is wrong. But psychologically, loneliness is often evidence of growth. When you have lived inside a role, you were never truly alone, because the role kept you tethered to others like a chain. Healing breaks the chain, and for a time you are suspended in emptiness. You do not yet know who you are. You are not the old self, but you are not yet the new. This is the liminal stage, the desert, the dark wood, the night sea journey. In myth, every hero descends. Every transformation requires a descent. The empath's descent is into the truth that their love has been mixed with fear. Now, do not misunderstand me. Empaths genuinely love. Their hearts are real. Their tenderness is real, but their love was often trained inside a wound. And what is trained inside a wound always carries a hidden bargain. The bargain is, if I give enough, I will be safe. If I understand enough, I will not be left. If I carry enough, I will be chosen. Healing dismantles this bargain. And this is where identity truly changes. You stop bargaining for love. You begin to sense slowly, painfully, that love cannot be earned through self-erasure. You begin to understand that genuine love does not require you to become a ghost. You begin to see that when you were needed, you were praised. But when you had needs, you were punished. And so you unconsciously built a self-image where needing was I am full. This is a crucial mechanism. Shame is one of the deepest forces shaping empath identity. Shame says my needs are too much. Shame says my anger is dangerous. Shame says, if I demand, I will lose everything. Shame turns you into a silent servant. Shame turns you into a psychic laborer. Shame turns your sensitivity into obedience. When healing begins, shame is exposed. The empath begins to have strange experiences. You begin to feel anger where you used to feel guilt. You begin to feel clarity where you used to feel confusion. You begin to feel disgust where you used to feel sympathy. You begin to feel distance where you used to feel attachment. And you panic. You think you are becoming hard. But what is happening is that your psyche is restoring instinct. You are becoming more animal in the sacred sense, more rooted, more honest, more aligned with the body's truth. There is a moment in healing, often quiet, often unannounced, when the empath realizes, I no longer want to exist, plain myself. This is massive, because explanation has been a strategy. You explain to prevent anger. You explain to prevent misunderstanding. You explain to keep peace. You explained because your survival depended on being understood by unpredictable people. But a healed psyche does not seek permission to exist. A healed empath stops explaining, not out of arrogance, but out of sovereignty. This is why identity changes. Your previous identity depended on translation. It depended on being interpretable. It depended on being palatable. Healing makes you uninterested in being palatable. Now let me speak of dreams, because the unconscious always announces transformation through symbol. When the empath begins to heal, dreams often shift in a specific way. Before healing, dreams may contain chaotic houses, broken rooms, intruders, floods, endless searching, missing children, collapsing structures, dark corridors. Such dreams reflect a psyche that has been invaded. The empath has not been living in a home. They have been living in a haunted house. Then as healing begins, the dreams change. You may dream of doors. You may dream of locking something. You may dream of leaving a house. You may dream of a train station, a ship, a bridge, a forest. You may dream of losing your phone, of forgetting appointments, of not answering calls. The conscious mind will interpret this as anxiety. The unconscious interprets it as liberation. The phone is the symbol of emotional obligation. The missed call is the symbol of not responding. The train is the symbol of fate moving forward. The forest is the symbol of the unknown self. And often there is a figure in these dreams, a stranger, a shadowy man, a severe woman, an old wise presence, an animal. The empath's unconscious begins to send a guide. Sometimes it is a wolf, sometimes a black horse, sometimes an owl, sometimes a snake, sometimes a lion. These animals represent instinct, raw psychic truth. The empath is being called Ba, CK, to a deeper intelligence, not the intelligence of social emotional scanning, but the intelligence of nature, boundary, appetite, rhythm, withdrawal, attack, rest. Empaths must learn this. They must learn the sacredness of withdrawal. They must learn that solitude is not failure. It is the womb of individuation. Now, because you asked for a Jungian lecture, I must place this within the larger map of the psyche. The ego is the center of consciousness. The persona is the social mask. The shadow is the rejected material. The anima and animus are the inner contrasexual images shaping relationship to soul and meaning. And beyond all these stands the self, the totality, the organizing principle, the deeper intelligence. Empaths, by temperament and by adaptation, often live too much through persona and complex. Their persona is the good one, the understanding one, the safe one. Their complex is mother complex, father complex, savior complex, then run the machinery of life. But healing, G, begins when the self intervenes. The self demands that you stop living as a function. The self demands that you become a person. And a person is never merely kind. A person is whole. A person contains no and yes, anger and tenderness, refusal and generosity, distance and intimacy. A person is not an emotional utility. A person is a living contradiction, a living mystery. So when you heal, your identity must change, because you are shifting from persona-based existence into self-based existence. This shift is experienced as death. Yes, death. Because the ego clings to the known, and the empath's known identity is built around being needed. To lose being needed is to lose a kind of existence. This is why many empaths sabotage their healing. Because the moment they become healthier, they become less necessary, and necessity has been their drug. Necessity has been their proof of worth. This is one of the darkest truths. The empath can become addicted to being required. That addiction, one, is not evil. It is tragic. It was born from early deprivation. If you were not emotionally chosen for simply existing, you learned to become valuable through service. You learned to earn love by being helpful, and therefore, being needed became your identity. Healing breaks the addiction, and the withdrawal is brutal. There will be days when you feel empty. You may feel meaningless. You may think, if I am not helping, I have nothing to offer. This is the voice of the complex speaking. This is the old program trying to restore itself, but the self remains calm. The self whispers, you are not here to be useful. You are here to be real. In fact, in this place, you begin to experience something that may confuse you. You become less emotional but more alive. You feel less desperate but more grounded. You feel less attached but more true. This is because your sensitivity stops being a defense and becomes a perception. There is a vast difference. The wounded empath feels everything as threat. The healed empath perceives without drowning. The wounded empath absorbs. The healed empath observes. The wounded empath merges. The healed empath relates. Your identity changes from sponge to witness. And this changes everything. Because the empath who heals can no longer participate in certain dynamics. They can no longer be seduced by guilt. They can no longer be manipulated by sadness. They can no longer be controlled by the silent demand of other people's needs. The empath becomes strangely untouchable not because they are armored, but because their inner center is no longer outside themselves. And this is where the spiritual dimension emerges. The modern world speaks of spirituality as light, but true spirituality includes darkness. True spirituality is the union of opposites. It is the integration of shadow. It is the capacity to hold tension without collapsing into a role. The empath's healing is spiritual because it is the recovery of the soul from captivity. The soul, what Jung called the anima, is not sentimental. The soul is wild. The soul speaks through longing, through symbols, through dreams, through sudden sadness that has no obvious cause. The soul is the feminine principle in the psyche, whether you are man or woman, because it represents depth, eros, relatedness to inner life. Empaths often confuse soul with others. They confuse eros with rescuing. They confuse depth with suffering. But as healing begins, you reclaim the soul as your own. You stop seeking meaning through sacrifice. You stop imagining that love must be painful. You stop worshiping longing as if it were destiny. You begin to sense that the real sacred life is quiet. It is not dramatic. It is not rescue. It is not obsession. It is not being chosen by someone who needs you. It is being chosen by your own self. This is the true change. And so identity must change because you were previously living as an extension of others. You were living as a satellite. Healing pulls you back into your own orbit. It makes you gravitational. It makes you a center. But the birth of a center is terrifying because once you have a center, you must say no. You must disappoint. You must let others feel what they feel without fixing it. You must allow them their own pain. You must let them face their own shadow without you serving as the mirror. This is what feels selfish to the empath. But it is not selfish. It is psychological maturity. Now let me give you a very precise image. Imagine you have lived your entire life with your house open, doors unlocked. People enter, they leave. They bring noise, mud, demand. You clean, you cook, You accommodate, you say it is love, but you are exhausted. Healing is the moment you lock the door not to punish others, but to finally live inside your own house. At first you feel guilt, because guilt is the alarm system installed by your old identity. It rings whenever you choose yourself. It says you are bad, but you are not bad. You are simply no longer available for invasion. Over time, guilt becomes a faint sound, and then it disappears, and in its place comes something new, peace, not the peace of collapse, not the peace of numbness, the peace of having boundaries. And once boundaries exist, your identity must change, because boundaries create individuality, and individuality creates destiny. The empath who heals begins to understand, my life is mine. This is a shocking realization for those who have spent decades living for others, and it will not be gentle, because the moment your life becomes yours, you will see how much time you lost. You will mourn. Yes, you will mourn not only relationships, but the self you could have been. This mourning is sacred. It is grief for the unlived life. It is the soul crying for its stolen years. But grief is also cleansing. It washes away illusion. It melts old contracts. It softens the ego's grip. Then after grief, a new power appears. A quiet power. The power of not reacting. The power of not explaining. The power of not being pulled. The power of letting people misunderstand you. The power of letting them leave. The power of letting the world be disappointed. This is not cruelty. It is freedom. And freedom changes identity, because the empath's old identity was built around reaction, around responsiveness. Healing gives you a pause, a space, a distance, and in that distance you meet the self. You begin to hear an inner voice not contaminated by other people's needs. You begin to sense preferences, desires, limits, rhythms. You begin to discover what you like when nobody is watching, when nobody is demanding, when nobody is sick and calling for your medicine. This is the birth of authentic identity, and it is strange at first, because you will feel unfamiliar to yourself. You may look in the mirror and feel something like disorientation. You may feel older or younger. You may feel as though a costume has fallen away and you are standing naked. I feel fear that you will become lonely forever. But what is actually happening is that you are finally becoming real enough to be loved in truth. The old empath was loved for utility. The healed empath becomes lovable for essence. Now do you see the full enormity? Healing changes your identity because it changes what love means. Previously, love meant, I will endure, I will carry, I will understand, I will never abandon. Healing teaches you that love also means, I will not betray myself, I will not be used, I will not call hunger love, I will not call anxiety destiny. Your new identity becomes an act of discernment, and discernment, in psychological terms, is a function of consciousness. You become more conscious. That is the definition of healing, not comfort, consciousness. And consciousness always destroys what is false. So yes, your identity cannot stay the same, because the empath's old identity was a temple built on unconscious bargains. Healing is the earthquake that Kala, PSE's the temple, so you may meet the sacred not as performance, but as truth. In the next part, I will take you further into the deepest mechanics, how the healed empath's psyche reorganizes around the self, how the shadow returns as authority, how the anima becomes a compass rather than a wound, and why the world begins to feel strangely quieter when you stop being everyone's emotional instrument. When you ask me to continue, I must warn you. What comes next is not a pleasant philosophy. It is a map of what actually happens when the empath heals. When the unconscious begins to reorganize the personality from the inside, most people speak of healing as if it is a return, but psychologically it is closer to an initiation. And every initiation destroys an earlier name. For a long time you have lived as though your sensitivity were your essence. Yet sensitivity is not essence. It is a medium. It is a doorway. And doorways are dangerous when they have no guardians. The unhealed empath is a house with too many open entrances. The world walks in. Other people's moods move furniture inside you. Their contempt scratches the walls. Their longing sleeps in your bed. And you call this closeness. You call it destiny. You call it love. But it is not love. It is invasion mistaken for intimacy. Then healing begins and something almost unbelievable occurs. The doors begin to close by themselves, not because you force them with moral discipline, but because the psyche begins to defend its own integrity. This is the first sign that the self has awakened. The self, which is not the ego, does not beg. It does not bargain. It does not argue with your childhood. It simply begins to restructure the whole system. At first, you experience this restructuring as fatigue, a profound fatigue that does not belong to the body alone. The empath begins to feel the weight of their own history, not as memory, but as a burden that has been carried unconsciously for years. You may feel tired of conversations that once excited you, tired of explanations, tired of the emotional theater of others, tired of being the good one. This tiredness is not depression. It is a sacred refusal. It is the psyche beginning to withdraw libido, psychic energy, from the false arrangement. I must explain libido here, because modern people misunderstand it as merely sexual. Libido is the flow of life energy. Wherever your libido goes, your life goes. The unhealed empath pours libido into others, into their moods, into their crises, into their problems, into their approval, into their suffering. The empath often has an erotic bond, an emotional eros. They do not admit it. They think they are being generous. Yet the psyche has its own truth. You are attached to being needed. When healing begins, libido returns. It comes back from the outer world like a river reversing its direction. And this reversal feels like emptiness at first, because you are used to being externally fueled. You are used to being motivated by other people's needs. When those needs no longer possess you, you feel disoriented. Many empaths call this losing myself, but you are not losing yourself. You are losing the role that pretended to be you. This is the precise point where identity starts to fracture, and fracture is necessary, because your old identity was a single-sided construction. It was built on a narrow moral axis of yes, yes, yes. It was built around availability. It was built around emotional labor. It was built around the belief that you are most lovable when you are least demanding. This is not an identity. It is a sacrifice pattern. So the psyche begins to break it. How does it break it? It introduces paradox. The healed empath begins to experience impulses that contradict their former self-image. You may suddenly want to disappear. You may feel cold. You may want to stop answering. You may find yourself unimpressed by people you once adored. You may even feel boredom in the presence of those who used to fascinate you. And you will feel fear, because your persona has relied on being warm, open, understanding. Now you discover another part of your psyche, the part that does not care. And that part is not a demon. It is a guardian you never had. You see, the empath is often born in a home where boundaries were not honored. Perhaps there was an emotionally hungry mother, perhaps an absent or tyrannical father, perhaps a family system where you were treated as a tool. In such a system, the child's ego never learns sovereignty. The child learns compliance. The child learns emotional service. The child learns to be good at reading the room rather than reading the self. Therefore, the empath's shadow contains sovereignty. It contains the instinct to refuse. It contains aggression, not cruelty, but healthy aggression. The power to push away what violates you. And when healing begins, that aggression rises. This is where many people sabotage themselves. They become afraid of their own boundary. They interpret their refusal as becoming narcissistic. They interpret their anger as becoming toxic. They interpret their distance as losing empathy. But in truth, the empath's earlier empathy was not always empathy. It was hyperattunement, which is a symptom of fear. It was an unconscious scanning for danger. True empathy is free. True empathy has choice. True empathy can say no and still remain compassionate. Only a healed psyche can empathize without surrendering itself. So identity changes because your empathy transforms from compulsion into capacity. This difference is enormous. Now we must speak of complexes, because the empath is often ruled by them. A complex is like a personality fragment. It is not merely a thought or a feeling. It is a constellation of images, memories, and effects that can seize the ego and behave like an independent being. When the empath is triggered, it is often not the adult responding. It is a complex, the good child complex, the rescuer complex, the abandoned one complex, the unwanted one complex. And these complexes have one purpose: to recreate the past until the psyche can resolve it. This is why the empath repeatedly enters the same dynamics, especially with emotionally unavailable, self-absorbed, or chaotic people. You call it attraction, you call it fate, but psychologically it is repetition compulsion. The psyche is trying to heal the original wound by recreating it. It is trying to transform the past by reenacting it with new actors. Healing interrupts repetition, and when repetition is interrupted, the ego experiences panic, because repetition, even when painful, is familiar. The empath's identity has been built on familiarity with suffering. Many empaths feel most alive when there is emotional intensity. When life becomes calm, they feel empty. Why? Because calm is unfamiliar. Calm feels like abandonment to a nervous system trained on chaos. This is tragic, but it is also the key. Healing T. He's you to tolerate peace. And to tolerate peace, your identity must change, because your old identity was wired for drama. Now I want to take you into a deeper layer, the archetypal structure of the empath. The empath is often possessed by the archetype of the wounded healer. In myth, this figure heals others because of their wound. They become wise because they suffer. They become needed because they bleed. But there is a shadow side to this archetype. It can become an addiction to suffering. It can become a subtle spiritual pride. I am special because I endure. I am chosen because I sacrifice. The empath may not say this aloud, but the unconscious lives it. And healing strips away that archetypal glamour. Suddenly you realize, suffering did not make you holy. It made you trained. And this realization is devastating and liberating at once. It is devastating because your identity has been built on the sacred meaning of your pain. It is liberating because it means you do not have to keep suffering in order to remain valuable. This is where identity begins to die. It is not the death of your sensitivity.